Hello and welcome to another episode of China Now, your go-to news and current affairs talk show offering you a comprehensive lens into today's China. This is the place where you discover how China works, how it thinks, and how it views itself in relation to the rest of the world. I am your host, Makiza Latifa, and as always, it's a pleasure to have you with us. We begin as usual with China Currents, your quick roundup of the latest headlines making waves across the country and beyond. Mimi is standing by with today's top stories, and here's a preview of what's coming up. Chinese astronauts make a safe return to Earth after a successful mission. Also, China dispatches troops to Moscow in a move drawing global attention. And tech giant Nvidia addresses and dismisses recent US-made rumors concerning China. Chinese athletes break barriers and win unprecedented honors for Asia. And Chinese citizens set new records for travel and spending during the Labor holiday. It's a packed show, so let's get right into it. Mimi, over to you.
China Current is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started.
Welcome to China Currents, your weekly news report on the latest developments in China. I'm Mimi, and in this episode, China's Nvidia slapped Trump's tariffs in the face. Chinese astronauts return to Earth with flies. China sends troops to Moscow. Nvidia condemns US-made rumors about China. Chinese players have won unprecedented honors for Asians. And Chinese people set a new record during the Labor Day holiday. First, a new boomerang for Trump's tariffs. On May 4th, Trump said he would impose a 100% tariff on movies produced outside the United States. However, on May 5th, the Chinese animated film Nvidia 2 slapped him in the face. It soared past $2.2 billion in global box office revenue, overtaking Star Wars: The Force Awakens to claim the number 5 spot in worldwide box office history. It now trails James Cameron's Titanic by just $110 million. Notably, only around $20 million of this came from the North American box office, serving as a reminder to Trump not to overestimate the importance of the US market. The milestone marks a historic first. Nvidia 2 is the only Asian film to ever break into the global all-time top 10, a list long dominated entirely by US blockbusters. For decades, Hollywood reigned supreme in the international film market. In 2010, Avatar became the first film to surpass 1 billion RMB at the Chinese box office, ushering in a golden era for Hollywood in China. But those days appear to be fading fast. In 2024, only 2 foreign films made it into China's domestic top 10. Warner Brothers' Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire at number 9, and Japan's The Boy and the Heron at number 10. Marvel's Captain America: Brave New World, released in February this year, grossed just $14 million in China, a sharp contrast to past MCU performances. On April 10th, China's National Film Administration announced that China would reduce the number of US films allowed into the domestic market, considering that Trump's tariff war against China would further diminish Chinese audiences' goodwill toward US films. On April 24th, the Chinese internet community Dike Yuzhou and Fudan University jointly released the 2024 Decoloniverse Global Cinematic Decolonization Index report, which measured the independence of national film industries worldwide. China ranked 3rd among 41 countries, with more than 91% of its top 10 box office revenue generated by domestic productions. It's probably time for Trump to watch fewer Captain American movies and reflect on the real reason for the decline of the film industry. Next, welcome back home, Chinese astronauts. On April 30th, China's Shenzhou 19 spacecraft successfully landed in the north of the country. The spacecraft and its 3 crew were sent into space in October last year to work on China's Tiangong permanently inhabited space station. But this time, not only 3 Chinese astronauts returned to Earth, but some fruit flies returned too. The experiment began on November 15, 2024, when the Tianzhou 8 cargo spacecraft delivered fruit flies to orbit. The research aims to explore how microgravity and other space conditions affect growth, behavior, and gene expression in living organisms. Chinese astronauts successfully bred 3 generations of fruit flies during this month-long experiment. This marks a key milestone in confirming that fruit flies are capable of reproduction in space. These findings lay important scientific groundwork for safeguarding human health on future long-duration space missions. So why do Chinese scientists choose fruit flies? Because they reproduce quickly, have a small number of chromosomes, and are well suited for genetic research. In recent years, scientists have found that about 75% of known human disease-causing genes have counterparts in fruit flies. Studying them has greatly deepened our understanding of human biology. Over 100 years ago, a single fruit fly with a mutation that turned its eyes from red to white helped Thomas Morgan confirm that genes are located on chromosomes. This discovery laid the groundwork for modern genetics and remains one of the most important milestones in biology. Morgan was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1933 for this work and related research. Since then, fruit flies have contributed to at least 6 Nobel Prizes in fields like development, immunity, neuroscience, and circadian rhythms. In 2023, Australian researchers used fruit flies to uncover a previously mysterious link between Alzheimer's disease and a genetic mutation, showing that it leads to neuron death. What new discoveries will Chinese scientists make from these tiny space travelers? Let's keep watching. Next up, let's go to Moscow. On May 6th, Chinese state media reported that the People's Liberation Army will participate in Victory Day military parades to be held on May 9th in both Moscow and Minsk, commemorating the 80th anniversary of the Great Patriotic War. According to Sputnik, over 20 heads of state have been invited to attend the Moscow parade, including leaders from China, Venezuela, Brazil, Serbia, and Slovakia. Russia played a pivotal role in the European theater of the Second World War. The Red Army liberated Berlin after sacrificing over 80,000 soldiers, a fact seemingly lost on Donald Trump. On May 1st, Trump posted on social media that he intends to officially rename May 8th and November 11th as Victory Days, claiming the United States contributed more to the outcome of World War II than any other country. Just a day later, on May 2nd, White House spokesperson Anna Kelly announced that the Trump administration plans to hold a military parade in Washington, D.C. on June 14th to mark the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Army. American media was quick to point out that June 14th also happens to be Trump's 79th birthday. As Trump himself remarked, America once lacked leaders who knew how to celebrate victory. Let's just hope the U.S. Army really wants to celebrate its birthday on this day by having a parade instead of a vacation. Moving on. On May 3rd, Nvidia publicly rebuked fellow U.S. AI company Anthropic for promoting stricter chip export controls on China. A spokesperson for Nvidia warned that given the depth of China's AI talent, highly capable experts at every layer of the AI stack, the US won't win the global AI competition by manipulating regulators. Instead, Nvidia reminded US AI firms that they should focus on innovation and rise to the challenge, rather than tell tall tales. The remarks came after Anthropic released a blog post claiming that China is smuggling advanced AI chips by hiding them inside prosthetic baby bumps and live lobsters. The post was intended to support the Commerce Department's Framework for Artificial Intelligence Diffusion, which is used to establish export controls targeting China's AI capabilities. As a leading global supplier of advanced chips, Nvidia has made its choice in the ongoing U.S. China AI race. On April 17th, CEO Jensen Huang met with Ren Hongbing, chairman of the China Council for the Promotion of International Trade, in Beijing. During the meeting, Huang acknowledged that U.S. export restrictions have already had a significant impact on Nvidia's business, but reaffirmed the company's long-term commitment to the Chinese market. Donald Trump once called Huang "my friend Jensen," applauding Nvidia's pledge to invest $500 billion in AI infrastructure in the US over the next 5 years. However, since he launched the tariff war, Nvidia's shares have been down more than 20% this year. On April 30th, Huang said at a tech conference in Washington that China is not behind in AI and that the gap between China and the US is very close. He noted that 50% of the world's AI researchers are Chinese, a fact he urged US policymakers to weigh carefully when shaping the future of the AI race. On May 6th, China's Zhao Xintong defeated Mark Williams to claim the World Snooker Championship title, becoming the first Asian player ever to win the sport's most prestigious crown. The 28-year-old Chinese player, nicknamed the Cyclone, swept aside 7-time winner Ronnie O'Sullivan. Zhao's victory made him only the second Chinese player, after Ding Junhui, to reach a World Championship final. After the match, O'Sullivan posted a photo of himself with a young Zhao, captioned, "How it started versus how it's going." On May 6th, Zhao entered the finals' fourth session with a 17-8 lead over Williams. Though the Welshman mounted a brief comeback to narrow the gap to 17-12, keeping alive hopes of a fourth title, Zhao sealed the deal with a brilliant break of 87 after the mid-session interval, securing an 18-12 win. He hasn't played for 2 years, bashed everybody up. There's a new superstar of the game, Williams said in praise of his opponent. Zhao's road to the title was nothing short of remarkable. In January 2023, he received a 20-month ban for his involvement in a match-fixing scandal that sent shockwaves through the sport. As a result, Zhao entered this year's tournament as an amateur and had to battle through 4 rounds of qualifying just to reach the crucible. Reflecting on his historic win, Zhao said, "It's a very special moment for me, for Chinese snooker, for everyone." Next up, according to statistics from China State Railway Group, on May 1st, the national railway system carried over 23 million passenger trips, including nearly 16 million trips on bullet trains. Both figures marked year-on-year increases of 11.7% and 16.1% respectively, setting new historical records. On May 5th, China's 5-day Labor Day holiday came to a close. According to China's Ministry of Culture and Tourism, the holiday saw 314 million domestic trips, a 6.4% year-on-year increase, with total tourism spending reaching $25 billion, up 8% from last year. This year, cities across China ramped up efforts to diversify tourism offerings and enhance visitor experiences. On the night of May 1st, for instance, tourists in Chongqing were treated to a dazzling drone show featuring 5,000 drones lighting up the sky. Nearby, a creative night market allowed visitors to sip coffee, listen to live music, and take part in traditional Chinese crafts. China's push to boost nighttime tourism also showed results. Official data show that cultural and tourism consumption zones recorded a combined 75.95 million nighttime visits over the 5-day period, marking a 5.2% year-on-year rise. The holiday also drew a significant number of foreign tourists. According to state media, inbound travelers from countries like Myanmar, South Korea, Malaysia, and Australia accounted for 57.4% of all foreign arrivals during the break. That's all for today. Thank you for watching this episode of China Currents. If you have any thoughts or comments, please leave them below. See you next time.
And next up, it's time for the Thinkers Forum, the segment where we spotlight insights from leading experts, scholars, and thought leaders with fresh perspectives on global politics. We begin with Jeffrey Sachs, who is the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at the Columbia University. In this edition, he shares his thoughts on how the world can protect, preserve, and advance genuine multilateralism in an increasingly divided global landscape.
Thank you so much for convening this ARIA formula meeting at an extremely important time and on a crucial topic. The crucial topic is how we can protect, preserve, and extend true multilateralism. That is governance according to principle, according to ethics, according to international law, and according to the standards of the UN Charter. We are, of course, in a multipolar world where power is widely dispersed across the world. But we are not fully in a multilateral world because of the abuses of the international system, as you have spelled out, Ambassador. Last year, I published a study. It's called the Index of Countries' Support for UN-Based Multilateralism. The purpose of the study was to measure how close or how far countries are from alignment with UN-based multilateralism. I am sorry to say that even last year, before this new round of unilateral tariff measures of the United States, of the 193 UN member states, the United States ranked last, 193rd in the world, making it the country least aligned with UN multilateralism. This is because the United States takes many measures that are outside of the UN-based system, that are in violation of the UN-based system, that walk away from UN commitments, and the United States votes against most of the world, most of the time, or much of the time, let me say, to be more precise, in the UN General Assembly. You have convened this meeting in part because of the immediate crisis that has occurred because of U.S. unilateral sanctions. These were called reciprocal tariffs, but they had nothing to do with reciprocity of tariffs. And let me explain briefly. President Trump made the claim that the U.S. trade deficit is caused by other countries abusing the United States. That if the U.S. is running a trade deficit, as it does with more than 100 countries, that this is somehow the fault of those other countries. Well, I have been teaching international macroeconomics for 44 years, and I can say unequivocally that a trade deficit is not a signal that other countries are somehow taking advantage of the United States. It is only a measure that the United States is spending more than it earns. In other words, that its total consumption and investment is greater than the gross national product. That is a statistical identity. the current account balance, which is the comprehensive measure of the net trade of the United States in goods and services with the rest of the world, that deficit equals the excess of U.S. spending over U.S. income. Now, why does the U.S. spend more than it earns? The reason is that the saving rate in the United States is very low, unlike China, where people and businesses and government are thrifty. In the United States, the saving rates are low of both the private sector and the public sector. But most notably, the U.S. federal government is running an enormous deficit, between 6 and 7% of our gross domestic product, $2 trillion of deficit per year. And that spills over into a current account deficit of $1 trillion per year. So the tariff measures are utterly unjustified by the economic claims of the U.S. government. The tariffs are directed towards a trade deficit that is not the fault of China's partners, but is the result of America's large budget deficits and low private saving. And so the United States is blaming other countries for its own economic policies. And this is extremely important. There is no excuse for these unilateral tariffs. Not remotely are they related to unfair practices of the rest of the world somehow cheating the United States. Now, the claim of the U.S. government was never examined by Congress. It was never debated in the public. It was made as a matter of an emergency decree that also, in my view, not only violates multilateralism, but also the U.S. Constitution, where Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution absolutely gives the power of tariffs to the U.S. Congress, not to the President of the United States. There are already several court hearings in the United States challenging the legality of the U.S. government's unilateral imposition of tariffs. I find no justification whatsoever economically for the actions that were taken, nor did the financial markets worldwide, which began to enter into a panic, and that forced the administration, in most cases, to reverse what it had done. Unfortunately, there is continuing damage to the world economy, including vis-a-vis China. Now, I want to emphasize that this unilateralism takes many forms. The tariffs is just one. And if you'll permit me, Ambassador, I would like to just list briefly. The United States is the biggest user of coercive economic measures other than tariffs, putting on sanctions on different companies, on individuals abroad, on banking sectors abroad. And so the U.S. is by far the biggest user of unilateral coercive measures. And the UN General Assembly repeatedly declares such unilateral coercive measures to be illegal, against the UN Charter. And they do enormous harm to populations all over the world, depriving populations of access to basic health care, to the most basic needs of food and clean water. They raise mortality rates. In other words, they are not only illegal, but they are extremely damaging to the health and well-being, especially of very poor people. The U.S., in addition, confiscates the assets of other countries, as it has done with the Russian Federation, with Venezuela, with Iran, with North Korea, with Afghanistan, and with other countries. It simply freezes the dollar holdings of other countries with which it has foreign policy differences. And this is an abuse of the prerogative of the role of the dollar in international settlements, because it is used by the United States as a weapon rather than as a payments settlement system. And this has become very serious. Under the U.S. Impetus, Europe, too, has engaged in these unilateral coercive measures, including the confiscation of $300 billion of Russian foreign exchange reserves, which is, in my opinion, blatantly against international law and against world interest. The United States, unfortunately, engages in many covert regime change operations, meaning that it engages not only in economic bullying, but in actually the attempt or the actual overthrow of governments. These have been now documented in very serious studies, counting by one excellent study, 64 covert regime change operations during the period 1947 to 1989. This is a staggering fact. No country should be overturning the government of another country under the UN Charter. Unfortunately, the U.S. is also engaged in arms buildups all over the world. No other country comes close to having the U.S. situation of 750 overseas military bases in 80 countries. This by itself, in my opinion, is highly detrimental to American security and a threat to the global peace. But it leads to arms buildups all over the world. I'm sad to say that the United States also is impeding the work of the UN system. When it comes to trade, the key to a rule-based trade system is the World Trade Organization, which the United States should take pride in helping to bring into existence. And yet the United States, since 2019, has blocked the appellate panel of the WTO so that dispute settlements cannot take place now at WTO because the appellate body does not have the requisite judges, because the United States is deliberately blocking the filling of positions of WTO so that that crucial rules-based institution can do its job. And finally, I would add that the United States has unilaterally departed from fundamental treaties of global significance, including from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002, which was perhaps the single biggest destabilization vis-a-vis Russia, because the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, was a bulwark of U.S.-Russia stability. The U.S. unilaterally abandoned the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty in 2019. And the United States is walking out, once again under President Trump, of the Paris Climate Agreement, which is a crucial global agreement under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change for world security. This is all quite dire. In other words, the break of the multilateralism, the fact that the United States, such a powerful country and such an influential country in the world, is the least multilateral of all of the UN member states, poses major risks and challenges to the world. And I just want to mention them in brief and then to close. First are the broken economic relations. Economic trade, international trade, is not a win-lose proposition. It is a win-win proposition. When the United States and China trade, both sides benefit. When the trade relations are ruptured by unilateral tariffs, both sides lose. This is extremely sad. Of course, it's the poorest countries that lose the most when the WTO rules-based system faces such a crisis. The second cost, of course, is the arms race. The world is spending trillions of dollars per year on armaments right now, and God forbid they should be used. We must not, of course, use these armaments, but the waste of resources directed at these armaments is staggering. Many countries, including in Europe, are cutting their development aid budget to build their military budget. This is unacceptable for a peaceful world, and it will not satisfy our security in any way. The third cost, of course, is open conflict. These unilateral measures lead to war. And we have several wars raging precisely because countries are not obeying the international system. It was decided by the International Court of Justice last year, for example, that Israel is violating international law by extending beyond its borders of the 4th of June, 1967. And the UN General Assembly will hold a high-level session on the implementation of the two-state solution in June because of this violation. Israel, sad to say, is also one of the lowest-ranked countries in the world in multilateralism. So we get open conflict as a result of this. We also have the dire reality that we have come far too close to nuclear confrontation on several occasions, and the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists tells the world that we are but 89 seconds from midnight on nuclear confrontation. This is another risk that comes from the unilateralism and the bullying. Of course, when we have conflict, when we have bullying, when we have unilateralism, we don't gain solutions that we desperately need for climate change, for the green economy, for the future of a sustainable world, for the Sustainable Development Goals, as you mentioned, Ambassador. And so the diversion from an absolutely crucial agenda is one of the telling costs of all of this. We are all suffering from unilateralism. We all suffer from bullying. This is a lose-lose proposition. We created 80 years ago, our forefathers did a wondrous job to create the United Nations, to make a system of international law, a system of international respect, and we have the responsibility to promote it. And I thank you for today's very important session, because it is extremely important that we reverse from unilateralism and promote actively multilateralism and the UN Charter at every turn as the key for our safety, for our survival, and for our sustainable development.
And still on the Thinkers Forum, we hear from the President and CEO of the George Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations, David Firestein, who argues that the dollar is weakening and challenges the long-held belief that the United States remains a bastion of global stability, calling it a fallacy.
When the United States, under President Trump and President Trump himself, levied these incredibly high new tariffs on China, I'm not surprised at all that China would respond in the way that it has responded and essentially mirror those actions. Well, I think what China has done, to my mind, is quite predictable. And I think most people that look at China and have studied China, worked in China, and so on, as I have, and many others have, would have expected exactly this type of immediate tit-for-tat response. China has a deep commitment to the notion of formal reciprocity or symmetry. And, if you do something to me, I'm going to do it to you. As China's leaders are simply not the kind of leaders that are going to accept an optic where they are bullied or browbeaten into doing something, if not percentage point for percentage point, basically on the same order of magnitude, to the point where I think we now have 140 or 150% cumulative tariffs on the part of the United States levied against Chinese imports. And I think China is now at the 125% level, which is very comparable. China, I think, has also made the point that at a certain point, you don't have to mirror those numbers anymore, because once you get to a certain level of tariffs, you are essentially terminating bilateral trade. You're making the product so expensive that it doesn't matter whether it's 125% or 5 trillion%. You're going to end up with the same net effect, which is that the product is not going to come into the country. I think that with tariffs at these levels, I do think we all of us have moved further down the road toward decoupling than probably many of us thought would actually occur. I do think it starts to move the United States and China closer to what could legitimately be characterized as decoupling. I do think that we're in for a rough ride for the foreseeable future. It's difficult for me to imagine that China is going to take the initiative to de-escalate this, given the way that President Trump has handled the U.S. side of this equation. They certainly see President Trump's moves as aggressive, provocative, and obviously very unfriendly. I don't think it's within China's character as a nation among nations to then be conciliatory in the face of that. So I think we're going to see high tariff levels for quite some time. I would say it may very well escalate further than where we are even today. But there may come a point where the political pressure in the United States relative to President Trump becomes even more significant and intense than it is now. And it's already starting to build, as we discussed earlier. And it could very well be that President Trump himself finds a way to declare victory, and but not in response to anything that China does or doesn't do, but rather whether he acknowledges it or not, in response to the outrage of the American people, whose 401k retirement plans are being decimated, whose incomes are being decreased, whose purchasing power is being decreased, and so on. And it would be within the character of this president to declare victory at some point and say, I've made my point, I've won, we've won, America's winning again, this is the golden age, and now we can stabilize things at some level. But it won't be, in my estimation, my prediction, because of anything China does. All the dynamics are really about the United States. The last point that I would make on this is kind of an original idea I've put into the ether in the U.S. China relations field. One can make the argument that to the American political establishment, China is much more valuable as a problem unsolved than it is as a problem solved. And that maybe it's the case that President Trump has no desire to solve any of these problems, which is why he's doing what he's doing, because he would rather be able to run politically, and not necessarily in his own campaign, but have his MAGA Republican friends and colleagues run on China being the bad guy in the world rather than on having solved the China problems. And the reason for that is threefold. Number one, if you're running on China, you can use China as a measuring stick for your own personal toughness. Number two, you can use it as a bludgeoning stick to bludgeon your political opponents for being too soft on China. But most importantly, when you blame China and demonize China and excoriate China and say that China is the root of all evil in the world and everything they do is horrible and they're ripping us off and so on, then you can distract the American people from the sad fact that the American political class has actually done a very poor job solving our nation's actual problems. And for those reasons, it may very well be that President Trump and those around him have no desire to solve these issues, but rather to keep them percolating and bubbling and boiling for political purposes. And I think there's a very credible hypothesis that centers around that idea. I do think there is a real risk of that happening. I think as people begin to regard the United States as unreliable and mercurial, erratic, that it will call into question whether the dollar can or should play the same role that it is, and it's an outsized, incredibly important, integral role to the global economy and to world trade, with most trades denominated in dollars and so on. I think that's beginning to be called into question. Obviously, the dollar is weakening, and the notion that the United States is kind of a bastion of stability when the world often has tumultuous things that are happening and wars and problems and recessions. There's always been a sense that the United States is a country that could be relied on and that can kind of be a stabilizer, if you will, in the world to a large degree, at least in the view of many, maybe not in the view of everyone. But I think that is starting to be to erode that sense and perception, and I think that could have a negative impact on the perception of the U.S. dollar as a stable, reliable global currency in effect, and currency of choice. And I think we're starting to see some movement in that direction. As we hear in that direction, rather, we hear the BRICS and other groups starting to talk more openly about alternatives to the dollar in terms of settling trade transactions. And President Trump himself has commented on that phenomenon negatively. In fact, he said that if countries start to go down that road, he'll increase tariffs even more dramatically, which will, of course, create a vicious cycle in which other countries then react to that by going further down that road. And I do think it ends up very possibly, and I would say perhaps likely, marginalizing the United States from the dominant role that we've played in the world and in the global trading system. I don't think that's good for America, but evidently this administration does.
And wrapping up this edition of the Thinkers Forum is Shaun Rein, founder of the China Market Research Group, CMR. He weighs in on the ongoing U.S. China trade war, shedding light on one of the key justifications cited by President Donald Trump, the massive trade imbalance with China reportedly holding a $1 trillion US trade surplus and importing relatively few American products in return. Stick with us. Shaun Rein breaks it all down right after this.
So one of Trump's justifications for the trade war is the trade deficit, where China has a $1 trillion US trade deficit overall and isn't buying many products from the United States. But here's the reality. China wants to buy products from the US. They want to buy American semiconductors from companies like Nvidia, Qualcomm, or Texas Instruments. But the United States bans these companies from selling to China. You know, before the trade war, Chinese were buying about 300 billion US dollars worth of semiconductor chips from the United States. Qualcomm generated 66% of their global revenue in China. Texas Instruments generated 44% of their global revenue in China. So Chinese companies want to buy American technology, but the problem is America puts on bans or export controls. And so one of the biggest losers of the trade war is Jensen Huang, the founder of Nvidia. Nvidia, one of their biggest markets, one of their second largest growth driver in the world, was actually mainland China, as companies from DeepSeek to Alibaba to Tencent wanted to buy Nvidia's high-end chips used for artificial intelligence power generation. Now, last year, Nvidia already created a special chip to be exported to China that was a workaround from the original export controls slapped on China and Nvidia from the Biden regime. But Trump just banned these chips. And the day he banned the chips, less than 2 hours later, Jensen Huang landed in Beijing. And I think it's really important that we talk about how Jensen looked to the Chinese. First of all, he wore a suit and tie rather than his trademark leather coat. This was taken as a symbol of respect, not just to the Chinese people, but also to the CPC and the senior government leaders like He Lifeng that he met, the vice premier. He was showing respect to the Chinese people. But most importantly, not just in his dress, Jensen Huang said, "We are committed to the Chinese market and we want to continue to grow because it's an important growth driver for us." You know, Jensen Huang, just like Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, has been very publicly stated that they want to continue to do business with China, that they don't see this as the national security threat for the United States that a lot of people, xenophobes in DC are talking about. But here's the thing. Unfortunately for Jensen, I think you're not going to see an end of the export controls anytime soon. And China might not be as good a market from a profitability standpoint for Nvidia going forward as it should be, as xenophobia, as hysterics, as exaggerated national security threats, sort of ripple through DC, both among Republicans and Democrats alike. And that's why I have a book called The Split, in a book that I just wrote and came out a few months ago. I talk about how American technology companies probably should lower their expectations on the growth opportunities in China. The reality is that Chinese companies, even if they want to buy American technology, are too scared to buy American technology because they're scared maybe a year from now or 2 years from now, the United States is going to slap more export controls or going to slap other policies like not allowing them to service older products and older chips. And thus they're worried that their semiconductors will be unusable or will become bricks. To do that, as I wrote in The Split, China is focused on building up indigenous innovation. And so the Chinese government has spent hundreds of billions of dollars in consortium with private Chinese companies in building up a semiconductor sector. That's why you see, Huawei, which once was one of Nvidia's biggest clients, has now emerged as one of Nvidia's biggest competitors. And that's actually said by Jensen Huang and Nvidia itself in their annual report, where they say Huawei is now one of our major competitors. So what's happened is Nvidia and other American companies like Intel are going to get hurt by these export controls. So it's shooting America in the foot yet again by both Biden and Trump regimes. Intel was once one of the dominant semiconductor companies in the world, and 1% of their global revenue alone was sold to Huawei in 2016. But after export controls, Intel could no longer sell their chips and other technology to China. And that's why Intel just fired their CEO, Pat Gelsinger, and replaced him with Lip-Bu Tan, a new CEO. Now, part of Intel's problems, is due to poor strategy, poor execution on foundries, but a understated but very important problem was that they lost revenue because they couldn't sell to Chinese competitors. I think it was great that Jensen Huang, despite all of the xenophobia and fear-mongering in the United States, had the courage, had the bravery to come to China and say, China's an important market for us. And what's also very important is Jensen is ethnically Chinese. And so that's showing even with mainland China and Taiwan tensions, somebody like Jensen Huang can say, let's be pragmatic, let's figure out how we can work together and benefit both the peoples of the United States and the peoples of China. I've taken a very critical view today in talking about American foreign policy. But we have to remember, I am American. I'm a red-blooded American. I love the United States. I want to see America thrive. I might, want to go into public service and run for senator, or my dream job is to be Secretary of State. So I think Trump should call me when he finally fires Marco Rubio. But the key is, everything I'm saying right now is out of love for the United States and China. I want to strengthen America, and America can only be strengthened if we follow the advice of people like Jensen Huang and view economic trade between the two countries as beneficial. We have to ignore the Scott Bessents, the Peter Navarros of the world, and we need to push up the people like Tim Cook, people like Jensen Huang, who are really deep down in the trenches, understand supply chains, understand technology, and understand the need for profitability going forward.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's edition of the Thinkers Forum, and indeed this week's episode of China Now. We're truly grateful that you make the time to join us every Saturday at 8 a.m. Remember, your thoughts, feedback, and suggestions mean a lot to us. So don't hesitate to reach out through the email address displayed on your screen. I am Makiza Latifa, and as always, it's been a pleasure having you with us. Don't forget that through the show, we're taking you on an ongoing journey of discovery into China and its evolving place on the global stage. Until next week, stay curious and stay informed. See you soon.